Hello, and here we are with week 2 of Worldview book recommendations. Now, what I've challenged myself to do is to read an extra book every week that would improve my understanding of the world. This playlist would hopefully become a nice list of book recommendations. The second one is Prisoners of Geography, 10 Maps That Explain Everything About the World by Tim Marshall. It's a good read, highly recommended, interesting. Easy to understand. The reason why it's called Prisoners of Geography is because it shows how geographical factors affect both history and also politics and wars and tensions, even in the world today. So that and even technology can overcome these limitations to some extent, but they're always there. The good example with Russia at the beginning is he wonders that if maybe Putin today he says that he's Greek Orthodox, so if he does pray, maybe he would go to bed at night asking God, why aren't there mountains over here in this part of Russia? It's a huge country, 11 time zones. Russia is tough to invade, of course, because there are mountains over here, and over here there's so much safe area where you could fall back on and retreat, but that's a double-edged sword. It's also really tough to defend, and he just goes through all throughout over 1,000 years of Russian history how that the lack of mountains on that front led to issues for all of their political decisions, and that's one of the reasons why Russia wanted to extend out into Eastern Europe and kind of wishes they were there again. And you see that with their encroachments back into the same territory today, where some of these nations that came out of the Cold War are trying to make alliances with Europe, alliances with America to try to counteract this, and some have Russian populations. There's actually a law in Russia that it's in their constitution that they need to try to protect people who are ethnic Russians, because if their grandparents are Russian, they can count as Russian, and that's kind of their excuse to sometimes go into these countries and protect what they would protect Russian minorities, but really you can see Russia always acting in their own self-interests. Now, this book, it's called 10 Maps That Explain Everything About the World. It doesn't explain absolutely everything about the world, but it gets pretty close. It's a really interesting read. Even the conclusion goes into outer space and the melting ice caps and global warming, some things that could happen into the future, because these the constraints of geography that has shaped world history and politics today, there's very similar limitations that restrict us from leaving planet Earth and going into other places, and you could see technology trying to push against that by making new innovations, but still there's the limitations at the same time. And China is a good chapter. You'd think there might be more wars between the two biggest countries, India and China, but there's the mountain range right there. And of course, it always makes the news. You see celebrities talking about free Tibet and human rights, but China, they wouldn't like talking about human rights. From their perspective, it's just a matter of national security. For example, that's where they get a lot of their water from, up at those higher elevations, and controlling Tibet and that part of the world. That's just a way for them to make sure that India doesn't take their water. Even if India doesn't have any plans of doing that at all, they don't know that. They just feel safer if they have more control up there. It's interesting to think about. Or just Europe. It's not necessarily that white people are somehow genetically superior in history, just that that we have these plains and rivers, so it's very naturally conducive to trade, and that allowed for development in big cities. And over time, you had these nations shape. So you have like France and England, and that's what led to world wars, with all of these great powers concentrated in one small area. It's always great to look at how good books go over what led up to some of the world wars. And of course, with geography and conflict, it's always a huge topic with where did what's called Palestine come from, and the Gaza Strip, and that small little tract of land that causes so much conflict. But a big tract of land that is covered well is this 1,900 miles between Pakistan and India, who are not in friendly terms, and they fought in wars, and hopefully they won't fight in a bigger war or in a nuclear war someday either. One factor that it brought out well is that Pakistan, it literally means like the pure people, but the name Pakistan is also an acronym of the 5 nationalities that are in Pakistan. And one of the limitations is that over time, because of geography, these 5 people groups kind of developed somewhat separate cultures that don't even intermarry in many cases. And that is a block to a greater unity in the state of Pakistan with the 5 nationalities inside of it. And I like this quote from Christopher Hitchens. So I began to phrase a little pun joke about Kim Jong-il being, "Oh, dear leader," but it died on my lips. It's the Korea-Japan chapter was really fascinating. One thing it just talked about is how scary it is that they could throw 100,000 shells at one of the biggest cities in the world in their initial volley. That you have these it's such a poor country, but it has a huge military budget, and it's able to toss all of this there. And one thing that comes up over and over in the book is how some of the borders in the world are arbitrary. Really, after World War II, we spent most of our efforts on what to do with Japan, and with Korea it was almost just a junior officials that just suggested that going back to the 38th parallel, and the consequences that it's still it's not even it's just a ceasefire. It's not actual end to the war. It's still going on to this day. And since I live in Korea, it was also good to see that it brought up the Takashima Dokdo debate, which is an island. Now, Japan, that's disputed between Korea and Japan, who has a tense history because of what Japan did in World War II, how they colonized Korea. And one reason that one thing that they still fight over is Japan calls it Island Takashima, but if you use that, if you say Takashima in this country, people get angry at you. But Korea calls it Dokdo. If you're a foreigner that's in Korea for more than 10 minutes, someone will give you a lecture about how Dokdo belongs to Korea, and it talks about that. And it does a great job talking about how Japan is becoming quietly hawkish again, because after being forced to give up in World War II, they're not allowed in their constitution to have a military, only a defense force, but that has over time become more and more lenient. And there's some older people in Japan that never really liked what happened and never really in their heart accepted the defeat, and there's the younger people in Japan that never felt that they need to repent of the sins of their fathers. So Japan, that aggressiveness in Japan is slowly, quietly building up, and America almost has to just deal with it sometimes, just because they would want to have a relative friend in the region compared to some of the other players in that part of East Asia. It's interesting to see how Japan actually kind of has an aircraft carrier again. They just don't call it that because they might, we're just going to put a helicopter on it. The author of the book says that it's like having a motorcycle, but you name it a bicycle because you didn't turn on the motor yet. It's a lot of good questions about what could be a conflict in the future from this book. And it also talked about the geography of the expansion of how the settlers, the aggressive settlers in America, were able to unite into a superpower, but how the geography helped to influence that it was just smaller states in Central America and in South America. I think the most interesting thing in the Central America chapter was how China is becoming a big player, not just in Africa, but also in Central America, because some of those nations are oil states, like Venezuela. They're not doing so hot economically, Venezuela, but they do have oil. But the Panama Canal is still pretty significant, and it's America put it there. And there's a Chinese guy that's investing $51 billion. He's a tech giant guy. He's spending $51 billion to try to make another canal going through Nicaragua, just so China wouldn't need to be beholden to America in any way to get to, and also wouldn't have to go all the way around all of South America as well. There's actually there's 10 chapters in the book and a conclusion. The whole 10th chapter was about Antarctica, and it actually turned out to be really fascinating. How you think about aircraft carriers are really important for naval power, but also icebreakers are an important kind of boat, a ship in that part of the world, and America only has this one left, unlike in the Cold War, but Russia still has a big old fleet of them. And Russia actually went to the bottom of the ocean in the Arctic and planted a flag there. It's kind of just purpose of intent, like, oh, this is ours. And in some parts of Russia, they renamed the Arctic Sea the Russian Sea. And there's like a half a dozen little more countries that border this Arctic region, and there's a whole bunch of complicated rules about how far you get to go in, and it's interesting to see, because in the previous century there was all kinds of bloody wars and oppression over natural resources that were taken out of places like Africa. And will there be a war over Antarctica? Maybe, actually. But at least the countries that are the major players with the resources in Antarctica, and it's becoming a big issue because what was a potential source of riches in oil in that part of the world is becoming a probable source of oil because some of those ice caps are melting. The book points out well that there isn't actually any debate that there is global warming happening. That's a big issue these days. But the actual point of debate is what is the cause of it, what percent of the global warming has been influenced by human factors as opposed to this natural cyclical things that would have happened anyway. And that's where that debate is. But since that's happening, then there's more of the Arctic land is accessible, and so these natural resources are going to come into play in a big way in the future. So it causes new problems, like whenever there's transportation, there's smuggling. So these countries have to work together to fight piracy and smuggling, and these countries have to grab these resources in fishing and oil without getting in fights. Now, these countries are somewhat mature. A lot of these are powerful countries, so maybe they won't get in a huge war over the Arctic, but you never know. It'll be an interesting thing to see in the future. And again, that last chapter was applying this into the future and just wondering about what might happen with the world and rising sea levels and even the chances of going into space. With more technology, it becomes more and more possible for us to plant flags not just on the moon, not just at the bottom of the ocean, but even on other planets. But really, with all of the tensions that are going on in America, it hasn't happened yet, and we're not even sure if it will. It's a nice book. I'll see if I could read one more book next week as well.